Hello everybody, my name's Clare Bottle. I'm the Chief Executive of the United Kingdom Warehousing Association, known as the UKWA. I recently joined the organisation as Chief Exec and I've got a very collaborative approach to sharing best practice. So I was really delighted to be invited and have this opportunity to talk to other people from other sectors through the knowledge exchange about our experience of operating warehouses in a COVID secure way. So I've got a quick agenda here, which I'll just explain. I'm going to tell you a little bit about warehousing in the UK and the types of organisations that occupy warehouses. Then I'm going to go on to tell you something about the immediate response to the pandemic and how warehouses operated in a COVID safe way. I'll then come on to talk a little more about some of the more long-term challenges associated with the pandemic. And some of those are not quite as specific just to warehousing, but are more problems that businesses are facing in general. And finally, some conclusions from me. So I hope you'll find it interesting, and I'll crack straight on and start by telling you a bit about warehousing in the UK. So the UK Warehousing Association tends to represent mainly third-party logistics companies, what we call 3PL, third-party logistics. We represent about 900 companies from across the UK. And if you think about the idea of having storage in between 2 points in a supply chain, you might have a manufacturer of yarn and then a manufacturer who makes clothes out of the yarn. And those would be 2 parties in the supply chain. If they rely on a third party for warehousing or transport, that's where 3PL comes into the equation. So third-party logistics is really the bread and butter of the UK Warehousing Association, but we do work with some other warehousing companies as well. Within 3PL or third-party warehousing, a lot of the profit that is generated by those types of businesses is from throughput of goods. So there are usually 2 different types of price. You'll have a price for storage, which is so much per item per week to keep it in the warehouse. And that tends to be a very low price that just about covers some of the fixed costs of having a warehouse building to start with. And then you'll have a throughput, or what we call RH&D, for receipt, handling and dispatch. And that tends to cover more of the costs and it is a better price. So my point in explaining that is that if in a warehouse you're full and nothing's moving, then that can present problems financially. It's not a good place to be. So economically, some of the impacts of the lockdown and the pandemic have been quite difficult for warehouse companies to deal with. But equally, there have also been some opportunities that came from it. As you can see on this slide, there's a bit of an overview here of why warehousing matters within the UK economy. It represents something like £20 billion worth of turnover and employs at least 200,000 people. So we're a big part of the backbone of the UK economy. And what kind of companies use warehouses? Well, the UKWA actually worked with Savills, who are a property company, to update some of our facts and figures in a new report that came out earlier this year. So you can see 3PL on the left-hand side, which is the type of third-party warehousing that I was talking about. And you can see there that between 2015 and 2021, the amount of warehouse space occupied by 3PL has increased quite dramatically. In fact, the only sector that's increased even faster than 3PL is online retail. So that would be companies like Amazon in particular, but also others like maybe Boohoo, you might know. And you'll probably be familiar with the boom that we've seen even before the pandemic in online retail. But another interesting point is that, in fact, across all of these sectors, we've seen an increase in warehousing space over the last 5 or 6 years, and some of that predated the pandemic. Now, the effect of lockdown on warehousing varied quite dramatically depending which of these sectors you were in. So, for example, high street retail and food service. Food services companies like Brakes or 3663 that are servicing hotels, pubs and cafes with food, all of that closed overnight on the 23rd of March 2020. So for some warehousing organisations, there was an immediate economic impact that was very damaging. On the other side of that, you had panic buying and key worker status assigned to food and online retail, which meant that some of the throughput in those warehouses was difficult to keep up with because, again, of changes that were brought about by the pandemic and by lockdown. Manufacturing, the picture was quite varied depending what kind of goods were being manufactured. And postal services, it was declared by the government that they were supposed to operate as normal. So, there shouldn't have been an immediate effect economically, but of course there was an effect. And I'm going to come on to talk a little bit more about how that came about. So let me try and describe to you in a warehouse environment the sorts of things that organisations put into place straight away in order to try and counter some of the risks associated with the pandemic. COVID safe practices. The first one that I'll mention is the 2-metre social distancing. Now, for a lot of people, working in a warehouse means operating mechanical handling equipment, so driving something like a forklift truck. And for safety reasons, you would usually be at least 2 metres apart from anybody else who's also driving a forklift truck. So in that sense, you would say, well, maybe warehouses didn't need to do anything different. But that's not really true of all aspects of the work. So, for example, if you think about e-commerce, pick and pack operations, collating things into a box and sealing it up ready to send off to a consumer, that's quite a labour-intensive kind of activity, which would often happen in a small area of the warehouse with a lot of people working close to each other. And the reverse of that would be the processing of returns, things that are coming back from consumers, which again is quite labour-intensive and quite a manual operation where people would tend to work quite close to one another, and a lot of these types of operations had to be redesigned and the layout of the warehouse changed in order to be able to observe the 2-metre social distancing. And then if you think about certain household goods, things like fridges and sofas, it takes 2 people to lift them. So when it came to loading lorries or delivering them to people's homes, it would be very difficult to manage that 2-metre social distancing. And so some concessions were made where people were allowed to work side by side or facing away from each other. And really the transmission of the virus was highest risk when you were working close and facing each other. So people took that into account and of course introduced the wearing of masks as well. Although if you think back, mask wearing wasn't an immediate reaction. Not many people were wearing masks straight away in March 2020. Another aspect of COVID safe practices in warehousing, which applied to a lot of businesses, was the frequency and the thoroughness of the cleaning. So most warehouses already have cleaners that work there to keep the place nice and to make sure that the goods are well looked after. Frequency of cleaning was improved, and we have quite a lot of shift work in warehousing environments. So typically, if you are driving a forklift truck, when the day worker has finished and goes home, somebody comes in to work nights and will then work driving the same forklift truck. And so new regimes were put in to clean them down very thoroughly in between shifts to help prevent the spread of COVID-19. Another thing connected with shift work is the shift times. So if, for example, you had a 12-hour shift working from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., the shift time in some cases was shrunk a little bit so that you would come to work at 10 past 6 in the morning and leave work at 10 to 6 in the evening. And that staggering meant that the people who were working days and the people who were working nights could be kept into a separate kind of a bubble. And similarly, rather than having everybody go to the canteen for their meal break at the same time, in a lot of businesses, the idea was to try and stagger those break times so that you wouldn't have as much crowding and so that you could maintain maybe some different groups of working people within the working environment to help control any spread of the virus that might happen at work. The next point I'm going to mention is about sanitising and hand washing facilities. So we'll all be familiar now with the fact that hand sanitizer seems to have been quite a booming market. At warehouses, you also get quite a lot of movement and coming and going from lorry drivers, and it became a legal requirement to provide hand washing facilities for those people. So in some cases, arrangements had to be changed to make sure that lorry drivers who were bringing goods and collecting them would have access to sanitary conditions and hand washing facilities. The exchange of paperwork is another point, and I've got a photo here from one of our member companies. I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see it, but the lady behind the desk here is wearing gloves. She's holding a litter picker in which she's got the paperwork to hand to the lorry driver to go with the load that they're collecting. And you'll see that there's a barrier here to prevent the driver from coming too close to the desk. And so people had to be quite creative and come up with solutions of how they were going to exchange paperwork while still maintaining the 2-meter social distancing. And the use of pens, for example, I quite often saw a stack of clean pens that you could take in order to sign for some paperwork and then put that pen down somewhere else and have it cleaned to help facilitate the exchange of paperwork in a COVID safe way. Then there was the routine testing. So in quite a lot of workplaces, people's temperature was being taken. And I'm a little bit skeptical about the extent to which that was helpful, because from my own inquiries, I haven't found anybody who has actually identified any cases of COVID as a direct result of taking people's temperatures. But it certainly helped to put across a culture of being very risk averse and being careful. Alongside that, there were also lateral flow tests, which some companies were using to help to mitigate against the risk of the impact of self-isolation. And of course, last but definitely not least, were changes in communication and the focus on well-being. And all of that was really aimed at trying to help people to cope in pretty difficult and unprecedented circumstances, which were frightening. So these are some of the COVID safe practices, which, as I say, you might have seen in other businesses as well, but particularly in relation to warehousing, these are some of the changes that our members put in place during the pandemic. And now I'm going to go on to talk a little bit more about some of the longer term challenges and what that might mean for our sector and others. So the challenges of the pandemic. May they never be deemed low skilled again. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is forecasting and the inaccuracy of forecasting because of so many changes in the type of consumer demand. So patterns of consumer behaviour are really important for the management of supply chains, including warehouses, because we rely on forecasting to be able to assign resources. What I mean by that is, do we have enough loading bays to load the lorries? Have we got enough space to store the goods? Do we have enough people and forklift trucks to be able to move things in a streamlined way? And if you have too many resources, you're wasting money. And if you don't have enough resources, you won't be able to meet your customer service standards. So forecasting is really important. And during the pandemic, it became really difficult to have accurate forecasts about consumer behaviour because of things like the lockdowns, which suppressed some demand, and the panic buying, which increased other demand, and it was difficult to predict. My second point really is about change management and risk assessment, and that relates to some of the points on the previous slide. Businesses were concerned about the extent to which they might be liable if their people fell ill, and they wanted to make sure that they were indemnified against those sorts of risks by following very strict and thorough risk assessment processes. And of course, for managers, managing through all of this change was something that they wouldn't have experienced on quite that scale before. Talking about management, there was also questions around remote supervision. So when warehouse workers were classified as key workers, that threw up questions about, well, who can or can't work from home? Because if you're operating a forklift truck or picking and packing goods in a warehouse, then you definitely can't work from home. But what about the person who's supervising that team? And what about their manager, perhaps, who's managing the whole warehouse? Can those people work from home? And if they can, for how long before that then becomes unsustainable? Because workers were understandably a bit reluctant to welcome site tours and visits by management if they felt that it was unnecessary. But at the same time, they also wanted to feel well supported when we think about that topic of well-being that I mentioned a moment ago. So who exactly is essential, who can work from home, and the regularity of auditing all had to be rethought in response to the conditions of the pandemic. Another issue that I want to talk about is under-resourcing, and this was related to lots of different reasons why people couldn't come to work. Not just those who ought to be working from home, but also there were people who were sick and they couldn't come to work for that reason, or they were self-isolating because of having been in close proximity to somebody else who was sick. So the self-isolation restricted the number of people available to work. And then there were people who were shielding because of their health conditions, or responsible for dependent care, and especially for school children. So under-resourcing became a problem in labour-intensive warehouse environments where some people just couldn't come to work and there weren't enough people to get all of the work done. I think it would be wrong to talk about the pandemic without mentioning bereavement as well. 130,000 people or more have died of COVID, and in many workplaces that would mean that somebody's colleague might have lost their life, and that's always difficult to manage at work. I don't pretend to be an expert on this topic, but I did want to touch upon it because it put pressure onto everybody in the workforce, and it is a work-related issue. And deaths from other causes, you could argue, were a bit harder to deal with, in the sense that because of the isolation rules, you couldn't visit those who were dying in hospital, even if their illness wasn't directly related to the pandemic. So the challenge of dealing with bereavement has been something that managers and their teams have had to face up to in a different way during the pandemic. I want to move on to talk a bit about skill shortages as well. So we've probably heard quite a lot about the shortage of HGV drivers in the UK, and as you can imagine, that has an indirect effect on warehousing because of the management of resources, relying on having drivers to bring the goods to the warehouse and drivers to take things away again and dispatch them on to the next delivery point. As a result of the pandemic, driving tests were suspended, and there were hundreds and thousands of driving tests that should have gone on that didn't take place, and that's part of that shortage of HGV drivers. But the same kind of thing applied more generally to training, in that training budgets were cut, the availability of people to undertake training was challenged because of these issues I've talked about with under-resourcing and working from home. And that even included, in some cases, some mandatory training. So it was difficult to get training done in the normal way because of the difficulties of the pandemic. And finally, I'm just going to make a mention of the regulatory reforms associated with Brexit. Now, this is not a direct issue of the pandemic, but during the period of the COVID-19 pandemic, we also, in warehousing, had to roll out some quite new arrangements for paperwork connected with imports and exports because of the UK's exit from the EU. And doing that in a pandemic was difficult because that was the training issue as well, to make sure that people were up to speed with what was needed and what those changes entailed. So I hope that's been a rather quick but useful insight into some of those issues. And just in conclusion, what I'd like to say is that with the key worker status of warehouse workers, there's a newfound prestige for everybody in logistics. I think when I've told friends and family that I work in logistics in the past, they've sometimes been a bit sort of perplexed by what that might be about. And it seems as though the public and policymakers are a bit more familiar with why it is that warehousing and logistics is so key to the UK economy now. So that's a kind of positive outcome. In terms of the immediate response, I think that warehousing companies did a fantastic job of creating COVID-safe workplaces, facing all the different sorts of challenges that I've tried to describe. But for all businesses, these will be perpetual challenges. As you can see, the government asked the British Academy to do a study on this, and they've described a COVID decade in which they think that there will be a long shadow into the future as a result of what we've all gone through since the beginning of 2020. I think the way to tackle that, though, and I do want to finish on a positive note, is with a new focus on recruitment, on training and on well-being. And if if there's something good that can come out of this alongside the newfound prestige that I mentioned, it would be an acknowledgement in business that the well-being of workforces is really important. I hope that you agree with some of the things that I've said, but I'd be really interested in talking to you if you disagree as well. And so I'd like to just finish by sharing my profile from LinkedIn. If anybody would like to get in touch, either to find out more about the UK Warehousing Association or to discuss any of the topics in my talk, then I would really welcome that. As I said, I like to work collaboratively, and I'm really glad to have had the opportunity to talk to you through the knowledge exchange. That's it from me. Thank you.